you bring up baseball. Back in high school, I wanted to be a sports writer,
Yeah.
and I mean, I outgrew that. But 1969, the Miracle Mets, the
Yes.
Jets, and the Knicks. I mean, what an amazing year that was. I've never seen anything like it since.
Yeah, it is amazing. Well, I'm looking forward to getting into all of your work, especially the Lennon book. I'm fascinated. So thank you so much for taking a minute out today.
Oh, sure, happy to do it.
So let's begin our journey into your writing and your world by asking you this. 5 years ago, this pandemic was raging, changing all of our lives. How did you get through the pandemic of 2020, and how has it affected what you're doing now today?
When the pandemic started and in New York City, in Manhattan, it was especially horrifying because there were 1,000 people a day dying. And you'd walk past, the hospitals and you'd see these mobile morgues parked outside because they didn't have room to store all the dead bodies. And I mean, it was just a horrifying time. And the funny thing about it, and there is nothing funny about it, I mean, I really isolated myself early in the pandemic. I walked into the supermarket like early in the morning, thinking that there'd be nobody there. And I saw this guy with a cart full of vegetables and produce, and he was wearing a gas mask and completely covered in like plastic, and it just seemed like something out of dystopian science fiction. And at that point, I really started to isolate myself. And the funny thing was that it wasn't all that different from what my life was like before the pandemic, because basically I was just sitting in front of my computer working on my new book. And I was just doing it more. And it's, not like things changed that much for me, but it's just like, all right, everybody else is living like I am now. So, that's what the pandemic meant to me. And I was lucky I did not get COVID at the worst of the pandemic. I got COVID and my wife got COVID, and the people we were staying with got COVID in 2024. No, yeah, 2024, when we went to Spain to do an event in Sevilla. And it happened the day after the event. And I had gotten every vaccination that there was, every booster, and I was sick for maybe 24 hours.
Okay,
So,
interesting.
that was my COVID.
So let me ask you this. You had mentioned sports writing kind of as we began here. Take me back to your childhood. Was that always your dream? Was that your dream job to be a writer?
Uh, at a certain point, I don't remember exactly when it kicked in, but in high school, I started getting serious, and I joined the school newspaper. I covered the football team, and I love football. That was probably my favorite sport.
Yeah.
And then I went to college. My parents did not want me to be a writer, even a sports writer. They felt that I'd starve. And I went to college to be an architect. And I realized that, well, I couldn't do the math, I couldn't do the physics. That was just not for me. This was well before the days where everything was done by computer. And I dropped architecture after 1 year because I just wasn't that good at it. And the school had all these different newspapers, and I joined the alternative newspaper, Observation Post, which was really an underground student newspaper. And that's when, in my sophomore year at City College of New York, that's when I started getting very serious about being a writer.
What was it about your early years growing up that gave you this love of the word, gave you the love of wanting to write? Was there specific things, seeds that were planted early on?
Now, not when I was that young, but around high school, college, I started to realize I was very good at this. And I just thought, if you're good at something, that's what you should pursue professionally. And yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to really, start making money and be a real professional. And I did that um, a lot by, editing magazines, writing for magazines, writing for newspapers. But yeah, it was just the realization, probably most strongly in my freshman year of college, that this was something I was really good at, and this was something I wanted to do.
So before we get into Nowhere Man, I got kind of a personal story with Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Memoir. My dad was born in Brooklyn at 55 and then moved to Massapequa. And, that was kind of the suburban shuffle at that point. But I remember when he only told me this once. He told me about the Dodgers leaving Brooklyn, and it was like a soldier that didn't want to talk about the war. And it was one of the most painful stories I ever watched him tell me about how he said they would drive around with cars and have like dummies tied to rope that had the name of that owner that moved him to LA. When you were really digging into Brooklyn, how seminal was that moment, that cessation of leaving, of the baseball team leaving?
I am probably one of the youngest people alive who still has a memory of the Dodgers being in Brooklyn. They left when I was in kindergarten.
Wow.
And, I remember them. And my mother was a Dodgers fan, and my father was a Giants fan. And my father, well, I write about this in a Brooklyn memoir that my father had a candy store on Church Avenue, which was walking distance from Dodger Stadium. And Duke Snyder lived in the neighborhood. And, one day my mother was pregnant with me. One day, Duke Snyder came into the candy store for an egg cream, and my father made Duke Snyder an egg cream, and he paid him 10 cents, and then Duke got on the train right next door and took the train one stop to Dodger Stadium,
Wow.
and yeah, I remember the Dodgers. I remember watching them on this TV with a little tiny screen, and my mother and her Dodger friends, in the living room cheering on the Dodgers. And I got into this in a lot of detail in a Brooklyn memoir because the Dodgers were a big part of my life. And when the Dodgers left, I started rooting for the Yankees. And then, in 1962, I think it was, the Mets came along. And, who wants to root for these losers? I'm going to root for the Yankees. And, it's just more fun to root for teams who are really good and
Yeah.
win.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing about Brooklyn that's interesting, I have a jazz radio show. There's so many cats that live in Brooklyn. It's like Brooklyn's going through a renaissance with artists and musicians. Is it cool to see that Brooklyn's become this vital kind of artistic hub today?
Well, what's really strange is when I was growing up there and I was living home when I was going to college, I finally moved out of my parents' house in 1975. When I was growing up there from like 1952 to 1975, Brooklyn was a place to escape from. There was like, yeah, it was very provincial. There was very little that was cool about it as far as like, places to go. I mean, they had the Brooklyn Museum and all that, but, there was nothing really cutting edge that was going on. If you wanted something cutting edge, you went to Manhattan. And that's where I ended up going to college, and there was a lot more going on. So now, it is very weird to see Brooklyn as this hub of counterculture.
Yeah, for sure. So who was your hero growing up? Who did you look up to as far as writers or thinkers or anybody who motivated you to become who you are today?
Well, my heroes when I was growing up was Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle on the Yankees, and Duke Snyder on the Dodgers. But that was like, it's just like the Dodgers are the vaguest memory, but I was crazy about the astronauts, John Glenn and yeah, Alan Shepard. So, those were my heroes. I didn't start really getting into into writers until I was in college. And, the three writers who probably influenced me the most are Henry Miller, Hunter Thompson, and Philip Roth.
Wow. So let me ask you this. What was the first thing that you wrote that you gave to somebody and you saw the twinkle in their eye? You felt that you had this knack and it motivated you. Do you remember a moment like that?
Yeah, probably. Well, in grade school, we had to do like, compositions and write short stories and things like that. And I did get, very good marks on those kind of things, but it still never occurred to me to be a professional writer. And my parents, like I said, were just so discouraging that you're never going to make money. Artists don't make money, artists starve. So it probably wasn't till my freshman year of college in you know a basic expository writing course that I got very high marks on the essays and the compositions, and my teachers were encouraging. And then that was when I was an architecture student, but in my sophomore year I switched from architecture to writing. And, that's when things really took off. And, I started publishing in the, alternative underground paper. It's called Observation Post. The book I'm writing now is really a history of Observation Post. And it kind of centers on the 1970s when I was there. And it explores how a newspaper that was basically, its whole existence was, anti-authoritarian, anti-war, very anti-Vietnam. That was like its reason to be, kind of evolved into the mid 1970s, into the late 1970s, into kind of a it became punk. It gave up the whole anti-war thing, and it became an outrage for the sake of outrage publication that was into testing the limits of the First Amendment. And we did all kinds of outrageous things, just to express our disgust with the ongoing war that we couldn't seem to stop, with the Nixon administration, Nixon Agnew, which was just like so corrupt and so horrible till he was finally impeached. And, then we got Ford. But, at just a certain point came the realization that, all this protest, all this writing, all this demonstration, it didn't stop the war. Nixon was still president, and we just started expressing pure outrage. And that's what punk was, outrage for the sake of outrage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, this is the history I'm exploring now. I eventually became the editor of that paper, and we just got, very good at getting attention and pissing off all these powerful people, like, various people in government, the senators of New York State, and on and on. And I'm just exploring how this happened, what exactly we did, who attacked us, and who defended us.
Yeah.
And that. And that's what the book is I'm writing now. I'm coming down the home stretch. I hope to be finished in the next couple of months.
Isn't it wild that now in these modern times we're heading down kind of similar paths with Nixon living through this era?
When you read the stuff about Nixon and Agnew, yeah, it sounds very similar, if not identical, to what people are saying about Trump and everything that's going on now.
So let me ask you a question about Nowhere Man. I'm fascinated by John Lennon and the lore. I got into a rabbit hole recently, and when they were doing that bet in, Yoko and John were in they got questions from people, and someone wrote them a letter and said they had a dream that Brian Epstein was trying to stop an assassination attempt on him. Do you remember, did you ever see that?
That Brian Epstein was trying to
The
stop the
the ghost of
assassination
yeah,
of John Lennon?
the ghost of Brian Epstein
Oh, the
channeled this
ghost of
person. Yeah, the ghost.
no.
And because there was supposed to be an assassination attempt, and John's just kind of nervous. Yoko's kind of look. It just got real weird after he read it, and he was trying to be funny and try to play it off. But you could see Yoko was uncomfortable. But I'd never seen that, and I guess there was some missive before all of this went down. And I know how close Brian was with the guys before he passed. So who knows? But I'm curious, how did this fascination with John Lennon come up for you? What made you write the book?
Um, well, that's a story I get to in the first chapter. That, from the time I was 11 years old when the Beatles came to the U.S., I was a Beatles fan. Um, the first album I ever bought with my own money was Meet the Beatles, and I got that within a couple of days of when I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show. And this was way back in 1964, and I guess I was, what you'd call an ordinary fan. I was never like a total Beatles freak. Um, but, I bought quite a few Beatles albums. And, even, after the Beatles broke up and I stopped paying that close attention to what was going on, yeah, I would still hear it on the radio. And I was just absorbing all this Beatles music and Beatles lore by osmosis, really. And things went along, and then I was on the college newspaper, Observation Post. I met this guy. His name was Fred Seaman, and we became friendly. And his family was connected to John Lennon and Yoko Ono. That his uncle Norman had produced Yoko's performance art pieces in Carnegie Recital Hall. His aunt Helen Seaman was Sean Lennon's governess. And when Fred graduated from college, um, his first job out of college, he was hired as Lennon's PA. And from his first day on the job, he began the job February 1979. His first day on the job, he came to me and he says, "We have to collaborate on a book about John Lennon." And he was, inside the Dakota, seeing John and Yoko virtually every single day. He traveled with them to Palm Beach, to um, Bermuda, and this whole time he was feeding me information about what was going on with John and Yoko and Sean at a time when John had dropped out of the public eye. And I had been keeping a diary at that point for many years. I started keeping one in early 1977. And this is 1979. So all this stuff that Fred was telling me about John, I was writing down. And then this was going on all in 1979 into 1980. And then, as everybody knows, December 8th, 1980, Lennon was murdered. A couple of days after the murder, Fred comes to my house and he says, he was broken up about it. He was very upset. He had been crying. This was all obvious. He said, "Now is the time to begin working on the book." And we started doing that. One of Fred's jobs was to take pictures of the Lennon family, and he had all these photos, exclusive photos, exclusive, intimate photos, of their lives behind the scenes. So it started out as we were doing that. And I was like, writing about each of the individual photos and trying to put them into some kind of coherent order. Um, One of the things that Fred told me soon after John was killed was that John had had a premonition of his death, and when he was in Bermuda in the summer of 1980, when John was putting together the demo tape for what became his double fantasy album, that he had told Fred that he had this premonition of his death, and that if something should happen to him, it was Fred's job to tell the true story of John's life and to avail himself of any research material he needed. And in May 1981, about 5, 6 months after John was killed, Fred brought to my house the diaries that John had been keeping between 1975, when he got back together with Ono, and up to the day he was killed. And these diaries became, the key to the project to write this John Lennon biography. And what I did over a period of many months was I transcribed the diaries word for word. And then, again, this is all in the first chapter of Nowhere Man. I transcribed the diaries. I'd been working hard. Fred gave me money to go on vacation. At this point, Yoko had fired him, and he had an angel backing the project. And I was out of town. Fred at the time, he'd been living in the Dakota. When the job ended, he had to move out of the Dakota. He was kind of homeless. He asked me if, when I was out of town, he could stay at my apartment. And of course, I said yes. I gave him the keys to the apartment. I went to Jamaica for vacation. I went to Bermuda to do some more research. And then when I came back, my apartment had been ransacked. Everything I'd been working on was taken.
Wow.
Uh, I went into a state of shock. I realized after I couldn't believe this is what happened. Fred admitted he had done it. He told me I was off the project. I realized after about a week or two of being in a state of shock that I had portions of John's diaries memorized. I started writing down everything I could remember, and that was eventually how the book Nowhere Man came to be, except between the time I started writing down everything I could remember about the diaries and turning this into a full-length manuscript, 18 years passed. And I had been trying to get this published for 18 years, and I just, got rejected up and down the line. Everybody was scared of this, scared of that, scared of lawsuits. Eventually, after 18 years, a small publisher in New York said yes. I got a deal for the book. And the book became an overnight bestseller. That was 25 years ago. And, over those 25 years, there's been all these different editions in all these different languages. The book became a bestseller in many countries. And as we're doing today, 25 years later, I'm still talking about it
Wow.
because that's what people want to talk about.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. When you look back on your life and career of everything that you've done and accomplished, what are you the proudest of?
What am I the proudest of? And um, yeah, I think all my books are very good. They're also all overshadowed by Nowhere Man. And I I think it was just a testament to my willpower that I was able to stay with this for 18 years and keep getting rejected until somebody finally said yes. And over those 25 years that the book's been out, I've just heard from all these people in all these different countries about how much the book meant to them. And with Nowhere Man 2, I went from basically being an obscure freelance writer to an author with an international bestseller. And it changed my life.
Yeah. So everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, fans, everyone that knows you, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I am a writer who, basically sits in front of his computer for many hours a day, and I work on whatever book I'm writing on. That's my perception. Then when I'm finished doing that, very often I will, go out and take a long, long walk, and kind of walking for me is like meditating. That I start to turn over everything in my head that I've been working on, usually that day, and like certain sentences or paragraphs that have been giving me trouble. Um, Things I was like struggling with to rewrite 10 different times and it's still not right. That, the answer will suddenly pop into my head, and I'll record the answer on my phone, and then I'll go back the next day, and that's where I start working with the answers that I recorded on my phone to the stuff that was giving me trouble the previous day. So, I guess of all my professional accomplishments, I am proudest of Nowhere Man and what happened to it. And, it just feels good to hear from like all these different people for so many years, how much the book meant to them and how the book changed their lives and their perception of John Lennon.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. You had mentioned Hunter S. Thompson. If you went back to your prime in your life, do you think you could have kept up with him? Would you have been able to run with him for a while?
Yeah, Hunter Thompson eventually committed suicide.
Right.
And
Right.
no, yeah, I think he was an amazing writer, but he took things, he just took it all too far.
Yeah.
And no, I mean, I'd like to live, a long, healthy life. I
Yeah.
mean, I like marijuana. I like, edibles. I like the idea that marijuana is legal in New York now. And like, on the way to the grocery store, I could stop by the marijuana store and, get some edibles and then, pick up, milk and eggs.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, um, I when I was a lot younger in my early to mid 20s, his whole thing about, just, taking all these drugs and going crazy, that seemed kind of appealing. Um, but, at this point, I'm 73 years old now.
Yeah.
And it just, it's too crazy,
Yeah.
that I'm just trying to stay sane and healthy and keep working. And, I don't want to put a bullet in my head at some point like Hunter Thompson did.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Absolutely.
the writer I'm probably closest to is is Henry Miller.
Yeah.
And he lived a long life and kept writing to the end. I mean, that's what I would like to be able to do.
So if anybody wants to get out there and, dig in a little bit more, Robert Rosen, NYC.com, is that the best place to go?
That is the best place. I'm also on all the social media, and yeah, but the best place, go to my website or just Google me, and all sorts of things will come up.
Okay. I will put all this in the show notes. What a delight, man. Robert, thank you, sir. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. Best of luck with the new book.
All right, thank you for having me on, Joe.
Yes, sir.